Hi patrons, and welcome to this month's hourly installment. And this month I'm going to show you something that I get asked about a lot, and that is how to create a blurry background and really make your subject matter pop out of the page. So I'm going to show you how you can go from a photograph that has a very busy background and simplify that to create something much nicer for the painting. So I hope you enjoy the tutorial. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk you through how I get from the photo reference given to me by the client to what I came up with for the painting. Initially this was going to have a plain background, just white, but if you know my work, you know I'm not that keen on a plain background. I love the background to tell a bit of the story. So I had to think of a way to simplify this. Obviously the first thing that jumped out was this TV, so that could be easily removed. Just with more of the wall colour. But I wanted to take all the busy distraction away from back there and put our focus really just on Lottie the Spaniel. So I'm going to show you the photo after I photoshopped it a bit, and then I'm going to show you how I got to this stage, what I did to create the blurred background. So here I thought it was good that you can still sort of see the light source coming in through what is still a window, and then I also liked the door frame, which brings some of these wooden warm tones up into the background. You can just about see a diagonal here, which gave a hint of the stairway out there. Also some idea of the table and some more chairs, bringing some of the red back there. So I quite like this as an idea for the blurry background, and I'll show you now how I get to that. So I'm using Photoshop. It's a CS6, but any version of Photoshop you'll be able to do this. There are also other free programs. I'll put some links in the description below. But really, editing software is such a useful tool to have. I use it on a daily basis. So the first thing I want to do is create a copy of this background area so that I can add a blur effect. So I've taken my lasso tool and I've set the feather to about 40. I want the edges to be nice and soft, and I'm just going to select very roughly around everything that I want to stay in focus. So I'm just really doing this quickly and roughly, which is enough for what I'm doing because I'm just looking at really as reference to paint from. So that's the background selected. I want to make a copy of that. I want to make sure I've selected my layer, copy and paste. So what I've done there just is make a copy of that background area on its own. So now I can go into filter, blur. I'm choosing a Gaussian blur for this, it's quite good. And when you play about with this, you'll see that it changes how blurry it gets. You can control it to quite a fine degree, so I think probably somewhere around there was what I went for. And I also thought that this was still quite dark behind her, so I wanted to lighten it as well. A couple of different ways in Photoshop. You can use your levels, or I like curves. And as I drag that up, you see it just getting brighter. So already Lottie stands out from the background. Another quick thing I did, if we zoom in photo reference, it's quite dark and around her face, so another cool trick if you want to just bring out some dark areas just to make it a little easier to see all the shapes of those curls. Image adjustments, and this is called shadows and highlights. Now it always comes up too much, but if you adjust this back down, you can see just a much more detail pops out of those dark areas. I use that tool quite often, especially on black animals. So that's already much easier to work from, and you can see how I was able to get from that to the finished painting. So we'll begin with the pastel stage now. I've got the foreground stuff drawn out pretty accurately, but I haven't really bothered to draw out much of the background, as I can do that now with the softer pastel. So I take white, or grade 27 is also good, a more yellowy white, and just start blocking in some of the lighter areas. So I can see quite a big patch of brightness just behind Lottie's ear, and that's a really good area which I want to accentuate, as it'll make her stand out really well. Also this window area, I'm blocking this in. I'm using grade 27 because it's a bit warmer than white. Eventually I'll come back and add more white on top. But when you want to block in on velour, try not to lean too heavily. This is a very thin layer which I'm trying to get on quite evenly. If you lean too heavily at the start, you'll fill the entire paper, so you want to leave plenty of tooth on there for the next layers. So those are the two brightest areas roughly blocked in. And next I use BE13, which in this it really looks like I'm putting on pretty much the same colour as the paper, and it is quite close to the colour of the paper, but I need a layer of pastel down there so that the next layer can blend really nicely into that, especially when I'm trying to create soft gradients like in backgrounds. Often I'll use the colour of the paper when I'm creating fur, leave bits of the paper showing through, but I find it important to cover all of the paper in the backgrounds so that you can create that nice soft blend. So I've just ripped a paper off one of the big pastels as I needed to use it on its side. So I pick up some BE17 and start to block in this doorway that we can just about make out in the background. I like this area as it creates some nice geometric shapes. The more of that going on in the background with no real definition to the edges, the more you can create something that's quite pleasing to the eye without being too distracting. So I take that same colour further down. This band of darkness across the middle I think is the table. The light area on top, I think it was just some items sitting on the table, but I like the way the light coming through the window reflected off those and gave us another band of light within the background. And now I take that same colour and block in the floor. I really wasn't sure what to do with the floor when I first started. It's a sort of parquet floor pattern. At first I thought I would leave it plain, but the more I progressed into the background, the more I realised I was going to have to add some hint of that, just because I was going to have the chair in such focus. It made no sense to have the floor just under the chair out of focus, so I had to figure out a way to graduate that detail from the foreground to the background. But for now I'm just blocking in solid areas of colour, really just drawing out the shapes, choosing what to include, what not to include. Remember, with this type of background, you don't have to be fussy. It doesn't have to end up looking exactly like the photograph. You're using the photograph there to give you a guide so that you can hint at some of these items in the background. And most importantly, when you're working on the lower layers especially, rub everything really well into the velour. The more you rub in, the more tooth is going to be left on the paper to accept the next layers. I think a common problem with the velour paper in particular, a lot of people find when they're finished the painting and they hold it up or the painting gets a knock, that a huge cloud of dust comes off. Well, there are several ways to tackle this, and one is in the way that you apply the pastel. So you'll see me all the time rubbing each layer really well into the paper. You don't want to have too much pastel pigment sitting loose on the top layers of the paper. So I'm just trying to blend some of that window area using additional 31, just softening the edges of the window. But it will take many layers to bring that up as bright as I want it to be. And this lovely yellow is yellow 17. Just picking out those solid areas of colour that I can see, blocking them in very roughly. Never too fussy with the first layer. It's gonna mostly get covered over anyway. I'm using it mostly to plan out where everything goes. Here I've got some BE6, just to bring a bit of that rich dark brown into the background. I don't want to ever have too much contrast in the background to take away from the foreground, but sometimes just bringing some bits of the colour from the foreground really helps tie everything together. I especially like the little flashes of red and orange that you get back there. So just enough to hint at maybe another dining room chair sitting back there. So this is the first tutorial actually where I'm not going to use any speed painting, so no time lapse. I'm able to show you this entire background because I did build it up entirely in just under 1 hour, so it will be nice when I'm able to show you things fully in real time and give you the full experience of the pace that I paint at. So I'm taking some red 7 there just to strengthen that lovely warm glow coming off the wood, and then taking some of the yellow 17 up into the wall, so there's a lot of warmth in the room. I don't want it to look too beige. I want there to be a lot of yellows and oranges bouncing around. And again, just giving every layer a good rub into the layer below. At this stage on velour, everything still looks so patchy. It's easy to panic sometimes at this stage when it's in its ugly phase, but you just need to keep adding nice thin layers, work it up gradually. So I'm just picking out the diagonal outside of the doorway. I really like that, giving us a slight hint of maybe a stairway outside the door. And I just like the fact that it gives us another geometric shape, another angle within the painting. So I use a bit of BE23, which I like. It's quite a nice plum sort of brown. I use it quite often, both as a brown and as a purple sometimes. And it just adds a nice bit of depth and warmth back there. Really, I just experiment with colours. That's the wonderful thing about pastel. You can pick something up, dab a bit on, you can cover it over if you don't like it. So a lot of the time it's trial and error. So I just want to go a bit darker back there for now, always keeping in mind that the next layers are going to knock everything back a few tones. So as I add more lighter layers on top, everything will get knocked a little into the distance. So now I bring some pure white, which is also known as grey 28 in Unison, and I'm just using it on its side. Not leaning very hard, this is quite a thin layer, but just rubbing it all in nice and gently. This really is the brightest area of the painting, so again and again I want to come back to those areas and make them brighter. Using some little circular motions, just rubbing it nice and gently into the fibres. Everywhere I can see a little glow of that light. And then when I rub it all in, you can see how it knocks it back a little bit. And the dust from this will come off the paper a little. Sometimes I create a small amount of a cloud of dust, but usually it's not too bad because you can see that I actually rub all the loose pastel dust. All of it actually gets rubbed into the paper with me, so I don't tend to waste very much. Not much falls off the pieces. And here I'm just using the grey 27, that yellowy white, extending the light from the window. So you can still see the edge between the white window and the wall. But I want the two to blur. So the sides of the pastels are so useful. You can create these thin films of colour, so when I see the colour of something, I never really think of what one colour I can put down to create that. It's built up in many layers, all blended, and it creates a real depth to your colour. Lets you add nice contrasts and reflections quite easily. So yeah, the main tip for building up backgrounds would be to use those pastels on their edges, on their sides. It also prevents you from trying to make marks that are too small, too fiddly, too soon. So you want your whole background to be made up of larger marks. I decided to include this bit of skirting board. I'm using some BE6 here. I felt it needed it in the foreground just to give us a sense of the perspective within the room. And also I added a little hint of the windowsill just at the bottom of the window. I felt these areas would be naturally in shadow, so we would probably be able to see them. So that's just some A31 in under the windowsill. Trying to think of some cooler colours for just underneath the windowsill as that area is in shadow. But then coming back in with a little thin film of that BE13. So the warm and the cool together in the shadow area under the windowsill. It's these little subtle films of colour really that I suppose add that touch of realism, as it makes it really seem like light is bouncing around in the painting as it does in real life. And just taking some more of the white, really strengthening that window. I usually don't advise taking reference photos where the subject is sitting in front of a lit window, but occasionally like this it can work out really nicely and you get a really strong lighting effect and it's quite dramatic. So I'm really rubbing quite hard, blending it all together. And already you can see it's starting to soften up a bit. And I've got my pastels sitting all around me. Because this is in real time, you'll see me reaching for some different colours. This is BV2, a nice lilac-y shadow tone, and it's one that I'll use later on in the dog, so it's great to find some shadow places to use some in the background. And I'm adding a thin film of that colour right over that wall that's in shadow. Of course it'll not show up as purple as this once I blend it in, add the next layers on top, but even just to get a hint of that colour shining through in the next layer, that's what's going to really give it the effect that it's in the shadow. So just searching for more areas now where the light is reflecting. Taking some smaller pieces of grey 27. Very lightly adding a film of colour right over this area. And I'm beginning to think about how I'm going to taper off from the detailed parquet flooring up into that blurred area. So I take some BE10, add a bit more of this zingy orangey brown, getting a little bolder with the colours I'm putting down, making them a bit more solid each time. You can see when I add that layer of BE13 over that bit of wall, it still has that faint shadow appearance of the BV2 shining through. And take some of the Brown Earth 17, just warm up that skirting board a bit. Now you'll see me argue with this line quite a few times. Partly, sometimes, how I've set the camera up leaves me a bit awkward for some of the lines I'm drawing, but sometimes diagonals and horizontals and verticals can catch you out, and it can be very tricky to get them freehand. I tend to use a ruler sometimes when I'm drawing things out, so that your lines in your initial line sketch are nice and accurate. Then when it comes to actually transferring your drawing onto the velour, if you do it freehand, you've got those nice crisp lines to go by as a guide, but the end result ends up looking a little bit more freehand and more natural. So I'm just thinking about the little area of shadow under that one leg that we can see the bottom of. And I just keep coming back to this skirting board here, as I want to be sure that the angle I've chosen seems like a natural angle to lead the perspective off into that back corner of the room. And now I pick up a nice zingy orange, something like orange 1 or orange 2, just to add a bit of vibrance. And you can see that when I blend it in, it softens down into those layers underneath. So I find you can always afford to be quite adventurous with your colour choices with pastel, bearing in mind that quite often what you apply will get knocked back a few tones, unless it's those final marks that you add to the paper at the end of the painting. And a little bit more of my BE23, just to bring some of that warmth down from the top of the doorway. So everything tends to look quite harsh when you first put it on, but after a few layers and blending, everything softens down into the paper. Using some of the white Just small circular motions, not leaning very heavily. I love velour paper for this kind of effect. It already has a sort of softness to it, so you can very easily create nice gradients. But unlike other pastel papers where the pastel pigment can move around a lot, it tends to stick quite a lot on velour, so it's difficult to get it to move until you've got a few layers of pastel on the paper. So if you want to create nice smooth gradients and soft blends, you need to get a few layers of pastel onto the paper first. So you'll notice no pastel pencil, no small fiddly marks really. Practicing backgrounds is a great way to try and loosen up. It certainly helped me. Thinking of painting things blurry really has done me the world of good, because it just helps you make bigger marks and be less fussy with the minor detail. And quite often when you stand back from a piece that has a blurred background, your eye tends to bring it into focus, or it plays some kind of trick with your sight. So it's such an effective tool to have, and really quite a simple thing to paint. I now really enjoy painting backgrounds where I quite hated them before. So just both darkening the top of the doorway and lightening just underneath it, just playing around with the blurred edge between those two. And a little bit of something like BE16 just to soften that division between dark brown and that orange. Using that yellow 17 again, just really making sure to get lots of nice glowing colours, not letting it go too white. But already I think it's much less busy, and that Lottie the Spaniel will stand out much better from this than from the original photo reference. Bringing some more of those yellow tones down the floor, and using a nice brand new BE6 to get a nice crisp line across that windowsill. So there's one example of how you can use the big fat unisons to get a nice accurate line. And I'm trying to put some of that vibrant orange just as a little line across the top edge of the windowsill. Things like that just give the effect of light dancing off a surface. It's such a lovely yellow tone, this. Quite a buttery yellow. And again, just using those small circular motions. And giving everything a good rub into the paper. So there is a hint of, I think it was the back of another chair, just down this right side. And I'm quite happy to bring that line on down. Really, as I go, I'm just judging what I think will add to the composition simplifying areas where it needs it. And for this flooring, I really didn't know what to do, because the part of the floor that's obscured in the photo reference with that blanket, I wasn't sure that I trusted myself to accurately sketch out the pattern, but I had a go and I think it turned out okay. So the great thing about pastel is you can go over the top of things so easily. So I chose a sort of mid-tone brown here, something like Red Earth 11. So if I go wrong at this stage, I can easily cover over these lines. Try again. I'm just lightly sketching in, trying to taper off into the perspective. I'm really not going to go into too much detail on the flooring. I want our focus to be on Lottie and even the chair she's sitting on, but I think it will help just to have a hint of that flooring. So it's tricky at this section. You can see that the perspective line of the skirting board goes off at a much different angle than the parquet flooring, so I've just got to be careful over there. And also I know that this area will be in quite a lot of shadow, so not too much detail required. And just start to think about some of those gaps through Lottie and the chair. So I continue across the bottom. At this point it's imagination only. I possibly went back and had a look at the original photo reference to see how the rest of that floor went off into the distance. I really only wanted to continue maybe about halfway up this chair before it starts to become too blurry to distinguish. So trying to think about the angle those slats might go at on this side of the chair. From the ones I can see just above the blanket, this feels like they might naturally join in. All the time I'm just making small adjustments, not worrying about it being too neat. And also considering that they would get smaller as they go off into the distance, so although I'm not going to continue them much further, I do want the last one or two to be slightly smaller just to make that effect work. So now I've got a rough outline of the main boards. I'm just going back in with the BE17. And then I'm going to bring some of that lively, vibrant orange over into this corner. There's so much reflecting around in this room. All those reds and warm brown tones in the furniture all seem to get reflected. So I want to make sure that all those vibrant colours I've used so far get used a little bit everywhere. So with my yellow 17, I just start to pick out some of the lighter highlights down the edges of some of these parquet pieces. Quite often there's just one edge where there's more light getting reflected off. So initially I try to go around and look for those highlighted areas. All the time I'm trying to make my outlines in the darker brown from earlier a little narrower, so I'm using the lighter tone just to shape the outline of these pieces. And you can see when I rub it in, it knocks it back quite a bit. Each time I make the marks on one of these pieces, I try to follow the grain of the wood, so in the length of the slat I try and make the marks in that direction. Just gives a little bit more of a feel of the grain of the wood and the way the light would reflect off that surface. And again, over in this corner, it's down to imagination a bit, so I try to look at how the light hit the top of the pieces further up the floor and apply that roughly to this bottom corner. Of course, when it gets to about this height in the painting, I'm really just going to hint very, very loosely at them. Here I'm using that yellow tone, the fat bit of the pastel on its side, just to get a nice thick mark. It's actually about the right width for each slat, so usually you can find a piece of pastel somewhere in the tray that is just the right size for a job. And just continue working down these with the yellow tone. Adding some more hints of green, trying to make those dark brown lines a little finer. So it's very rough and loose at the moment. But the great thing is about these sorts of backgrounds, quite often it's absolutely fine to leave it in this rougher state, and then that extra detail that you add to your foreground, it'll make that really pop. So sometimes the less you do in these backgrounds, the better it is. This in particular was one of the most simple ones I've ever done, and I really liked the effect, how much it made Lottie jump out of the foreground, so sometimes less really is more. I've just added some of that BV2 in that shadow area at the bottom of the skirting board, bringing in some of those shadow tones always, and a little bit of that vibrant orange too. And now I try to soften this right side, taking the pastel, that yellow 17 on its side, and really blending that area together. Even when I rub over lines that I've drawn, I can put a thin film over that, blend it, and you'll be able to very faintly see the line underneath, but velour really is great for creating these lovely gradients of colour. So I take some of the white now, bring some of that window's reflection further down the floor, knocking all these areas back a little. I'm very conscious of making Lottie stand out much more in the painting than in the photo reference, so my main aim is to create something light and bright and complementary to her. So around all of those edges, I'm thinking how her fur will stand out against this. And again, I come back in those areas where the brightest reflection is and bring it up another few tones. And continue with some of that BE13, just softening this gradient. And then coming in with a little wash of something like Orange 6. This is one of those nice thin films of colour, so I'm not leaning heavily. I'm just lightly going over everything, running over the edges of things. Even giving that shadow area a little bit of reflected colour. Everything just getting warmed up a little tone. And I take a little bit of BV1, using some really light tones of blue violets, just to add a little bit of a hint of shadow around the corner from that window. And you can see how lovely and smooth when you use one of the big pastels on its side. And that film just goes on so evenly. And really I've just decided to lighten the wall a little bit more, although you'll see when I blend it in then, that all mixes nicely. So I'm just thinking about what tone to leave behind Lottie's head. But really the more of these thin films you can put on, the more depth and colour you're going to see in your big blocks of area. Instead of just looking at solid colour, it's going to have much more vibrance and depth of colour. So at this stage, when you've got a few layers of pastel on the paper, you'll notice that everything starts to move really nicely. You can smudge it and blend and play about with it a lot more. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that you'll take away lots of helpful hints on how to create your own blurry backgrounds. Happy pasteling until next time.